David Clendon.
Kia ora, thank you, Mr Speaker.
Kia ora.
Mr Speaker, I'm pleased to add a few comments to those made by my colleague Jan Logie. The Greens are not supporting this piece of legislation for reasons that Jan has partly outlined, and we'll have a great deal to say.
Order. Member knows that they must use the member's full name in the House or their title.
Oh, my apologies, Mr Speaker, indeed, yes. Yes. This legislation that has been debated to amended, it is 20-year-old legislation. It was enacted in 1993. Not a terribly long time for some of us, but nevertheless a very different world. Computers were relatively scarce. The idea of home computing was much less commonplace than it is now. Telephones were still, mobile phones were still relatively novel. They were used for making and receiving telephone calls, and that is about the extent of it. We are in a very different context in terms of technology. To some extent, at that time and prior to that, our privacy was largely protected, or considerably protected, by the limitations of the storage mechanisms available, by paper and index cards and cabinets, filing cabinets. There was not the ability, or much less of an ability, to share information, to steal it, to take it either rightly or wrongly. Given that this legislation is 20 years old, there has been a remarkable increase in technology around information, data sharing. We don't deny the need for change. We're not resistant to change in itself. We simply don't see that the proposals in this amendment bill are those which will move us to where we want to be. The available technology clearly is a two-edged sword. We can acquire information, we can store it, we can analyse it, we can share it. Massive amounts of information can be moved around almost in a heartbeat, with no time delay. Our mechanisms for managing that data, for protecting it, for monitoring its use in an ethical and appropriate way, arguably are considerably behind our technical ability to work with it. And that is, I think, the dilemma that we're confronting here. The second dilemma, in a sense, has been almost perhaps referred to by the previous speaker. There's something of a cultural split in terms of electronic data and making it available. Those of my generation, I suspect we guard our privacy, our information, quite jealously. We want to know why and for what purpose people might want information from us. At the other end of the spectrum, I think a younger generation, what you might casually or perhaps in a very generalist way call a Facebook generation. Those who think nothing of putting very large amounts of personal data into the public domain. And I think, frankly, personally, I think there would be a healthy dose of cynicism injected into that generation might do some good in that sense. Clearly, it's much easier to put information out there than it is to retrieve it. To return to the bill, the purpose of the bill, in a sense, is not the core problem for the Greens. What we have difficulty with, we recognise the shortcomings. One example that's been pointed out to me is the inability of the family court to retrieve or to have information shared that might be available at the district court. And this can create difficulties, and we could improve that situation arguably. We do see that there are situations where data sharing, information sharing could enable better outcomes, could be appropriate, ethical and serve public good. However, the mechanism chosen, this proposed amendment to the bill, we don't see as the appropriate one. It's largely, as my colleague spoke to earlier, there is a lack of checks and balances within this legislation. I think much has been made of the fact that the Orders in Council would need to be, the Privacy Commissioner would need to be involved in the preparation and in that process of delivering those. But the Commissioner's report or feedback would have no binding effect on anything that was produced. It's purely a consultative mechanism. It is not one that gives us any confidence that the executive, any executive, might not overstretch the mark and use these mechanisms in a way that would not be appropriate, that would not be suitably cognizant of their absolute right to people to maintain their privacy. So we're not persuaded by this bill. We will oppose it. We look forward to the Select Committee. Thank you.
Mr Speaker.
I acknowledge the honourable member, Todd